Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land and the broader Kalamazoo area. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers. This is a weekly program here on Wider where we break down what is going on at the local, statewide, national, and international level. We analyze issues from a deft lefty perspective. Bunch of working class folks in Kalamazoo just analyzing and talking about the issues from our metaphorical front porches, but still outclassing the mainstream media because, of course, we read those books. And again, digging underneath the headlines, critiquing, the mainstream media, and, of course, calling out the establishment on its BS. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 FM WIDR Kalamazoo or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may turn out to be. So, we're going to spend the first part of our program diving into some local issues. Later on, though, don't touch that dial, because coming up around 12:35, 12:40, we're going to be broadcasting a long-form discussion, about an hour and 20 minutes or so, with Reverend Nathan Dannison. It's going to be the first episode of our book club series, which is something I'm hoping to do about once a month, where we take a look at some insightful political science literature or Marxist literature, et cetera, and really sink our teeth into it with a local guest. So it could be a local organizer, activist, or otherwise knowledgeable person in the Southwest Michigan area. And again, as I said at the top, we'll be joined by Reverend Nathan Dannison, everybody's favorite radical preacher dude, to dive in to the book Jesus and John Wayne, or how white evangelicals fractured a nation and corrupted a religion. I might be getting the subline slightly off there, but before that, though, I want to make sure we spend some time talking about some important local topics. And I wanted to start off with something from MLive. Now, for long-time listeners, this is something that is somewhat of an update, sadly. But it's about a local organizer, Issa Smith. Some of you may have heard of them, know them. And they have run into yet another housing issue. I'm going to read from the article, but as somebody who's also, we featured them on the show, talking about a previous property, and I do want to reflect a little bit of my own personal experience with this. So again, this is somebody that I have a lot of conversations with, just as a colleague. And as far as I can tell, from the information they have presented to me, they've got a pretty solid case here. And what it really sounds like is a landlord trying to extract some extra money from a tenant, and a tenant knowing their rights and sticking up for themselves, and then subsequently being evicted because, that's that song Rocco's Modern Life. There is a punishment for those who try to fight, quote unquote, City Hall. But the crux of this, it has to do with basically some foliage that was in their yard. Landlord tried to claim that they were responsible for, when actually it is the landlord's responsibility. And something I've looked into, somebody who has done some tenants' rights work in the past. But so with that context, let's go ahead and read the article, and I might be able to fill in a couple other little blanks as we go along. So the headline is, Kalamazoo family evicted in freezing winter after court battle with nonprofit landlord. This was published January 26th, written by Brad Devereaux. Issa Smith and her 2 children have been forced to vacate the Kalamazoo home where they have lived after a nearly year-long court battle with their landlord. The court battle ended Tuesday on January 25th when Circuit Court Judge Alexander C. Lipsey ruled to enforce an earlier settlement that Smith had signed, which required her to vacate the home in Kalamazoo's East Side neighborhood owned by Kalamazoo Family Nonprofit Housing Corporation. Smith's landlord, David Artley, is the former chair of the Kalamazoo County Public Housing Commission. Artley, who also heads the nonprofit that owns the house, resigned from the Housing Commission in 2021. He filed an eviction lawsuit in March 2021 over alleged damage to the home and lease violations. Smith hired an attorney and fought Artley in court for months, resulting in a settlement that Smith has since claimed she was coerced into signing. The settlement said Smith had to vacate the home by the new year. Smith asked for extra time to fight the case, she said. During Tuesday's court hearing, Lipsey ruled Smith had to vacate the home immediately, and the judge said she should expect the possibility of a sheriff's deputy arriving at her house in the next day or so to enforce the eviction order. Just a quick tip out there, if you're ever threatened with eviction, it is literally only the sheriff is able to carry that out. So, a landlord can't just show up and say like, oh, I'm kicking you out, etc. They literally need the sheriff's office or law enforcement to show up to do that. So, anyway, going back. Smith, who was previously homeless, told MLive following the hearing that she was looking for motels to stay at and trying to buy a home with money she saved recently. Once she realized she was probably going to be forced to leave, she said she rented a moving truck and bought storage units for some of her belongings. She claims the eviction stems from a dispute between her and Artley over alleged damage to the property in 2021. And because Smith refused to pay for issues she said she was not responsible for, such as a leaning tree. And so I think we talked about that at the top of the story. Smith also claimed Artley told her to send payments to him directly, and she questioned the legality of that practice. Artley disputes that he told her to send payments in his name, but acknowledged he accepted checks from Smith written out to him rather than the nonprofit. Artley said previously all the checks written to him were placed into the nonprofit account. Artley has since said he would no longer accept checks written out to him for rent being paid to the nonprofit that owns the home. Artley, when reached by phone Wednesday, declined to comment on Smith's eviction. Smith claims the home is in good shape and any damage amounts to usual wear and should not be grounds for eviction. She blames Artley for other problems with the house, such as electrical issues, and claims he would not fix them. Which is important to note. Landlords do have a responsibility to keep up with quality of life repairs like that. Again, I'm kind of putting my tenants union hat on with some of this stuff, but just to emphasize, like, yes, that does legally fall into the purview of the landlord. As part of the settlement, Smith was allowed to obtain a mobile housing voucher. However, Smith said she believes the eviction means she is now losing her housing voucher, which she has used to pay for a portion of her monthly rent. Smith's eviction comes as single-digit temperatures are predicted in Kalamazoo over the next week, with a low of -2 in the forecast Saturday. Smith points out the temperatures can be deadly in a short amount of time, especially for someone staying outside in the elements without adequate shelter. Smith said she's reached out to elected city and county officials asking for help. She still cannot find a suitable rental home for her family, she told MLive. Smith said she reached out to Housing Resources, Inc., a Kalamazoo nonprofit tasked with helping people obtain housing and avoid homelessness, but they did not help her find a place or offer any funds for a place to stay. It's the same organization working to bring pods to the city for homeless people to live in. HRI Executive Director Michelle Davis told MLive Smith contacted the organization recently and she is proceeding with HRI's process. The historic level of affordable housing shortage certainly doesn't help anyone facing housing crisis and homelessness right now, Davis said. Smith said she did not receive any help as she prepares to once again become homeless. So I'm going to defer now. So if you check out our Media Cyphers page, there is a GoFundMe going on for this family. And I really do want to hit the nail, in my humble opinion, as a journalist and an organizer. Well, not really a journalist, I'm more of a commentator. As a community organizer, I guess I should say, I feel that Issa is in the right in the situation. I think she did her due diligence, has the proper receipts, as we say, to prove that her side of the events is correct. And furthermore, the whole thing with David Artley. It's interesting, I haven't talked with Issa about this issue over the last several months. It's something that pops up a lot in local politics. David Artley, he was part of the housing board and such. And, it seems to me like there are things that a lot of our, city officials, whether they're elected or on these boards, they have kind of this public face, talking about we need to solve these problems. We need to do X, Y, and Z. And then when push comes to shove, they're trying to extract extra money from their tenants over, things like tree damage that they're not responsible for. And really the only thing, the only thing Issa did quote unquote wrong was saying, no, I shouldn't have to pay that. And then that really started off the chain of events that led to her and her family being evicted in the dead of winter. And, David Artley at any point, there's certainly options on the table for him personally to, waive this or drop this or defer this at least until the warmer months. A lot of people erroneously believe that it is illegal to evict in the middle of winter, and usually it is. But again, this I don't know too much about this contract that Issa was, as she claims, coerced into signing. But in any case, it's definitely very immoral to do so, and it really does emphasize, I think, the extent to which we all really need to get together when people in our community are being targeted like this. And, people are coming through with some resources and such, but I am hoping that, there needs to be more of a reaction. This has gotten some press coverage, of course, but local landlords need to be throttled a little bit, not literally, but so that they don't try doing stuff like this again. Because again, it does not reflect well that in the end, the tenant was evicted. I guess, a lot of legal headaches were created for David Artley and such along the way. But, you can't be throwing extra fees onto your tenants and then months later end up being able to evict them for that. So I'm hoping, the way a lot of these things work, the more people know their rights, the more people challenge these unjust decisions that are dished out by landlords and property management companies, the more difficult it is for them to single someone out like Issa Smith and go through with an unjust eviction like seen in this situation. So again, if you want to find out more about that, that's the MLive article, Kalamazoo Family Evicted in Freezing Winter After Court Battle with Nonprofit Landlord, written by Brad Devereaux. And there's also, I believe, a GoFundMe over on our Facebook page. That's Media Cyphers. So, from one kind of grift to another, I wanted to bring up something that came across my radar. This is a story from WWMT, and it's very local, and it has to do with people who are grifting some of the COVID federal COVID funds, and also very close to here. It talks about a COVID testing site that was close to campus. This is an article from January 26th. Headline, FBI investigates COVID-19 testing company and the Kalamazoo location closes. It was written by Tricia McCauley, published on Wednesday, January 26th. The FBI is investigating the Center for COVID Control for allegedly delivering inaccurate and falsified test results. The COVID-19 testing company opened more than 300 pop-up locations throughout the country, including one on Stadium Drive in Kalamazoo. The company closed testing sites nationwide on January 14th and said they would reopen on January 22nd. As of January 20th, the company said it was extending the pause and all locations would be closed until further notice. The Michigan Attorney General's office said it was investigating the testing center after receiving multiple complaints. Matawan resident Christy Buchanan said she got tested at the Kalamazoo location on January 10th and received someone else's results that were positive when she actually tested negative. I got my results and it said positive, but about a half hour after that, I got another message from them saying they made a mistake on my test and had apparently given me the results of someone with a similar name from another state, Buchanan said. The Attorney General's office said one of its complaints was about a worker at the Kalamazoo location that was providing tests while they were sick, and that proper cleaning was not being done. That's why the Attorney General's press secretary said they sent an agent and Kalamazoo County Health Department worker to the testing site for a surprise visit. They said staff allowed them inside and answered all their questions. The next day, the Center for COVID Control shut down all sites nationwide. I'm not surprised that they're being investigated because I feel like it was unprofessional from the moment I walked in, and they had very little knowledge of what they were doing there, Buchanan said. The Center for COVID Control said they will use the operational pause to train additional staff on sample collection and handling, customer service, and communications best practices, as well as compliance with regulatory guidelines. The Better Business Bureau, serving Western Michigan, said it has received multiple complaints about the testing center, including people who said they never got their test results. The Center for COVID Control has an F rating from the Better Business Bureau. So, again, that was just real quick. Wanting to tell you all about, very dubious testing. I actually went and got tested there a couple weeks ago myself. And, luckily, it does seem like there's more at-home tests available now than there were a few weeks ago. I know when Omicron was really spiking, it was, I think I complained on air a lot about it being something of a national embarrassment, like our total lack of testing kits and no masks and stuff. It does seem now things have finally caught up a little bit. You can go get your testing kits and KN95s at most stores. That is really unfortunate. I would also say there are other testing sites, places you get tested for COVID, urgent care. Most urgent cares in the area do it, as well as there's a CVS on campus that does both the rapid and the more detailed PCR test. So if you're worried that you got the Rona, there are other options than this potentially dubious operation they got going on over there. All right, we're going to take a quick little break. Come back. I think we got one more statewide story, and then we're going to go into the book club discussion. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR. Or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution.
.1 Wider FM is the student-run radio station at Western Michigan University. Along with the Western Herald and Western Herald Video, Wider is part of the WMU Student Media Group and is supported in part through generous donations from listeners like you. If you would like to join this list of generous donors, please click the donate button at widrfm.org and support our mission for radio evolution. The website, once again, widrfm.org, on your radio at 89.1 Wider FM.
We are back. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR FM or online at widrfm.org. Hey, once again, shout out to Quantum Fleek. I really want to thank them for so graciously letting us use their music as our background music for the show. If you like this recording, you can find it on YouTube. It's Quantum Fleek from July 20th, 2017, and it was recorded right here in the Wider Studios. So we got one more story before we want to dive in to the long book discussion, and I found this story really interesting. It kind of is a story of how Kalamazoo really dodged a bullet here, i.e. some recent revelations about Lee Chatfield. Now, if you remember from last year, there was a big hubbub. He was going to become the next director of Southwest Michigan First, which, for those who don't know, is really like probably one of the biggest roles in Kalamazoo's unelected power structure. For years, it was run by Ron Kitchens, who is really orchestrated and been a huge ideological influencer in the sort of kind of foundation for excellence model and the idea of kind of governing by philanthropy. And Lee Chatfield was going to be their pick as new chair until there was a huge local backlash because he's, homophobic. There's a lot of like right-wing dog whistles that were unearthed about him. A number of other reasons. Mostly just he was a very offensive personality and he seemed really underqualified. And this recent article from Bridge, Michigan shows, it's very interesting that the folks at Southwest Michigan First thought this guy was suitable because not only that, but not super surprisingly, apparently the guy was a big funnel of dark money and other fun stuff like that. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from this article. You can find it at Bridge, Michigan. Headline is, Lee Chatfield raised millions, traveled often, Michigan law kept much secret. It's written by Simon D. Schuster, published on January 25th. Lee Chatfield, 33-year-old father of five, made $95,985 per year as Speaker of the Michigan's House, and until recently had a reputation as a humble son of a northern Michigan pastor. Recently there were some allegations that came out from his sister-in-law about some sexual abuse. I'm not going to go too much into that story, but yeah, not really a great person in general either. But new revelations have emerged from former colleagues that he had extravagant taste and traveled so frequently he sometimes canceled House votes to catch planes, according to more than a dozen interviews by Bridge, Michigan and the Michigan Campaign Finance Network. Records show one nonprofit tied to Chatfield, the Peninsula Fund, spent nearly $500,000 on travel and food in 2020 alone, but IRS rules don't require it to disclose donors or explain how the money was spent. Some questioned how Chatfield could have afforded such a lifestyle, but Michigan's scant disclosure requirements for elected officials make it impossible to know many details about Chatfield's travels, expenses, or donors. Michigan ranked 47th out of 50 states in a Coalition for Integrity's 2020 Swamp Index, a measure of state-level anti-corruption measures. Senator Ed McBroom, the chair of the Senate Oversight Committee, reviewed an overview of Chatfield-related financials provided by Bridge and MCFN and called them very disturbing and very heartbreaking. By the way, he's a Republican, so that's coming from one of his inter-party colleagues. Chatfield, McBroom said, had been a longtime friend. I don't believe that this level of corruption is the norm, said McBroom, a 6-year state house member who was elected in 2019. The red flags we look back and see now, I don't see to this extent anywhere else in my tenure. But citizens deserve the assurance that that's not going on. Chatfield left the legislature due to term limits last year. Among other revelations, a Bridge MCFN investigation into his finances found the following. 1. 2 of his highest-paid House staffers under Chatfield also controlled the finances for the Peninsula Fund while owning a consulting firm that was paid nearly $500,000 from various Chatfield funds. One of the 2 staffers also coordinated Chatfield's travel, according to his brother. Oh man, sounds like just like a party time slush fund to me. Chatfield paid 4 immediate family members nearly $115,000 in total from various accounts since he was elected in 2014. And Chatfield went on numerous trips paid for by outside organizations, but Michigan's weak transparency laws meant he had to disclose none of them. Speaking to Bridge in December, Aaron Chatfield described a lifestyle that involved frequent flights, parties, and trips on a moment's notice. He went on more trips than anybody. He was gone all the time, Aaron Chatfield said. Lee Chatfield, who is married, has acknowledged a sexual relationship with Rebecca Chatfield and other women, but claimed their relationship with his sister-in-law was consensual and began when they were both adults. She alleges it happened when she was underage, and it was not consensual. Michigan is an outlier. I'm kind of going to go to the end here. Michigan is an outlier in how little transparency it requires of its elected leaders. It is one of 2 states that have 0 financial disclosure requirements for legislators. There is also no state ethics laws for Michigan lawmakers, and lobbying disclosure requirements are easily circumvented. I want to say something that kind of leaves out. A lot of this, some of this dismantling happened during the Snyder administration. I think you can even go back as far as like Engler in the 90s, and really there hasn't been much effort from Democratic administrations, think Granholm or even Gretchen Whitmer, to reconstitute some of these basic provisions that help prevent these excesses of dark money expenditures. That said, Michigan has also done a really good or bad job, depending on how you look at it, of gerrymandering the heck out of ourselves and maintaining Republican control. You know, again, there's this Republican on the Finance Committee who seems very, taken aback by Lee Chatfield's excesses, but his excesses wouldn't be possible if it hadn't been for years and years of a Republican-controlled House in Lansing striking down and striking away transparency and anti-dark money rules. So you reap what you sow. And luckily, Kalamazoo did not end up having to reap Lee Chatfield, thanks to the work of local organizers and organizations that drew a line in the sand. Again, their new pick, somewhat less controversial, but used to be an economic development guy in Las Vegas, so we'll see. I was joking with my partner. It's like, okay, so the guy running Southwest Michigan First now used to run Vegas, so can we at least get some gaudy casinos around here, or maybe let's get a pyramid. Let's just build a pyramid somewhere, maybe off Miller Road or something. We'll see. All right. Anyway, we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we are going to go into our long-form interview and discussion with Reverend Nathan Dannison about the fantastic book, Jesus and John Wayne. And that will be basically taking us to the end of the program tonight. So, again, I want to let y'all know there's several ways you can tune in and find the show. You can listen to the program every Tuesday from noon to 2, as you are doing right now. You can also find us online, and there's 2 ways to find us online. You can go to our YouTube page, where we upload every episode directly. It's a direct recording of our radio show, so you can hear one-to-one. We also have a podcast on Podbean, where we basically put together a best of from the show. We usually upload 2 to 3 of those each month. And that way you can download at your leisure, hear some of the most pertinent local and national analysis and such, including the interview we're about to do with Reverend Nathan Dannison. So anyway, keep it down locked. We got a lot more. We got some really interesting discussion about this book on the way. This is Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR-FM or online at WIDRFM.org, your only source for political revolution.
You are listening to Wider FM, online at WIDRFM.org.
Hello, everybody out there, either internet or radio land. If you listen on the radio, welcome all. Big thanks to 89.1 WIDR for, again, hosting our radical little show on their station. And again, you can find our kind of best of podcasts over at Podbean. That's Media Cyphers Kalamazoo. Today I'm joined once again by Reverend Nathan Dannison for what's hopefully going to be the inaugural installment of what I hope will be like kind of a monthly book club where me and a community member, either like a community leader or organizer, activist in some capacity, deep dive into a book that we think really resonates and something that you should check out and speaks to a lot of what is going on here in this city, state, and country and world. And we're going to be starting today's episode. And again, Nathan, thanks again, once again, for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this discussion.
Yeah, man, I'm super happy to be. Andy, I miss you. I don't do anything. I take naps all day. This is great. I'm happy to be able to participate.
Oh, well, thanks. I think we all needed some naps. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the book Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. It's written by Kristen Kobes-Dumez, a really accomplished writer, actually right here from the state of Michigan. And I think we're going to start just kind of some personal reflections before we dive into the nitty gritty, just kind of talking about our personal experience and how that kind of filters through our thoughts on the book overall. But just a quick synopsis, Jesus and John Wayne is a really great for tying together kind of the historiography of the evangelical movement going back to the late 19th century. And it kind of starts with this question a lot of people had around the 2016 election, which is how come so many evangelicals voted for Trump? And there's some hard data in the book, but it was something like 80%. And the book does a really good job. It has great explanatory power in really showing you how a lot of the pathologies that built up in the evangelical movement over the decades led to the result of Trump being elected. And it really argues that it wasn't an aberration so much as kind of like the sum total of what's been going on in that kind of evangelical circles. And some of those things that she focuses really on in the book is the emphasis on machismo, the transformation of Jesus from the Gospels into like the quote unquote warrior Christ, the development of Christian nationalism here in America is also a really important point. And it also spends a lot of time talking about and really putting names and faces to the development of this kind of evangelical Christian media ecosystem that has really kind of partitioned a lot of the American public into only hearing a particular version of what's going on, which, again, long time listeners of the show know that's something we talk about a lot. That's something I'm very interested in. So with that, I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about my personal experience. I think like hearing from Nathan's probably going to be a lot more interesting. As I've said before on the show, everybody's favorite radical preacher man. But I just wanted to mention this has really good explanatory power for me. I grew up in a household, a Christian household. My father was definitely not evangelical. Actually never was loyal to any particular denomination growing up. It was the Church of Gallardo, really. And as I explained in the book, a lot of the ideas from the overall evangelical movement kind of bled down into overall American Christian culture. I think they talk about a lot of like millennialism and the emphasis on the book of Revelations. That was something that was very big in my household. And also the idea of like America being like God's chosen people. And of course, my dad was also a big fan of John Wayne and Mel Gibson and all that stuff growing up. And the book does spend a lot of time talking about the kind of convergence of popular culture boostering. Although it's also worth mentioning, it's interesting for me as somebody who grew up in kind of like that white Christian household, where some of these ideas filtered through, and thinking through like, oh, I can really see from a firsthand perspective how this can mold people's ideas in a certain directions. Now, I did get lucky. In some sense, I think my dad did not adhere to some of the most toxic elements of this stuff. One of my favorite sayings from my dad growing up, there's this idea that's big in the evangelical movement that like we don't need to worry about modern problems because Jesus will come back and fix everything. And my dad's famous retort to that is Jesus is not a janitor, and there's an expectation that we will at least attempt to clean up some of our own messes. But yeah, a lot of that stuff filtered through, and that is a big reason I am interested in this book and its analysis of particularly what white evangelical Christianity has brought. So, Nathan, I'm going to toss it to you. And again, kind of something similar. Your life experience, especially doing a lot of more liberatory Christian practice. What are your overall thoughts in the book, and how does it kind of apply to you and help your analysis?
Yeah, well, this is a book that was needed to be written, and it's a book. We live in a culture today, especially in the publishing industry, where books are being churned out all the time, basically to pad people's CVs, especially in the church. This book, in particular, answers a question that people have been asking for decades, which is essentially, what is the evangelical church, or who are these people? And I'm reminded of a quote from another book, Adam Kotsko's amazing work of political theology. It's called Neoliberalism's Demons. And when he starts the book, he attempts to answer the question, what is neoliberalism? And he says, neoliberalism likes to hide. In other words, it's a very hard term to pin down because its proponents don't like to use the term. They just like to describe themselves as the status quo. Likewise, with the white evangelical church, in a minute I'm just going to switch to saying evangelical, they would never describe themselves as part of any one movement because, A, their default position is, well, no, we're called Christians. We are the Christian church and have the monopoly on it. Even though, even at the surface, that's an absolutely historically ridiculous thing to suppose. But also, they are allergic to any kind of denominationalism or schisms because they are in the market of making money. And so you don't want to separate your flock into different camps along ideological terms if it will cause your book sales or movie sales or whatever to diminish. So for a long time, people have said, well, when you say evangelical, who are you talking about specifically? And Professor Dumetz has really answered that question. So this is important. Personally, I've never been a part of the evangelical church. I was raised by a couple of college professors. I think if my dad's religion was anything, it was federalism. He was a military guy, a staunch patriot, very suspicious of authority for his own reasons. He used to take me, he wanted me to have a broad religious education. He really believed that the churches I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but he did say there were some churches that are connected to the founding fathers, as he would say, and so he took me to Unitarian Universalist churches and he took me to Congregationalist churches because he wanted me to understand that they have a place in American history. But other than that, I was really free to make up my own mind. I never fell into the trap of evangelicalism because when I went to high school, I think I went to one Young Life event and I thought to myself, Jesus, these are all the kids I sell weed to. So these jokers are just full-blown hypocrites. I don't want to have anything to do with it. In my early 20s, I did have a conversion experience where I dedicated my life to the ministry of Jesus Christ. but that didn't look anything like what most evangelicals count as being born again. For me, it was more that I took a covenant promise to reject the allure of material wealth and celebrity, and instead spend the rest of my life advocating for people who live in the margins and then fight for them. And that's, so my radicalization and my conversion to Christianity were really one and the same. So the book, one of the things that I think that it does that's so important is that it, first of all, distinguishes between the Black evangelical church and the white evangelical church. The white evangelical church is a product of a lot of the racism of the 19th century, as you touched on. It's important to remember that the Southern Baptist Convention was created in order to sustain slavery and segregation. That was its entire purpose for being. And a lot of these new modern white evangelical churches can trace some of their history back to that. So what is it? In my estimation, and I think that this pans out in the work, the evangelical church is a church that accommodates itself to power for the gratification of the men who control the church. And that right there answers most of the question of why Donald Trump. So it was a great read, principally because it's not a theology book. It's not a reflection on the church. It's a history book. And it's been amazing watching these powerful evangelical leaders really lose their minds on social media and through their publishing houses and their blogs over this book, claiming that it's everything from a malicious liberal screed to accusing Professor Dumetz of being a wolf. And frankly, all that she has done has been to publish history that's all accessible in the public domain, and they refuse to engage with her history. And to her credit, she's done a wonderful job of representing her work, because when she faces these often very powerful men, she simply responds with, please point to the place in the history book where I have failed to accurately represent the history of your movement. And she's always met with silence or bluster. So this is a great book. And it really helps encapsulate this sort of church movement that's very American and very capitalistic in a way that in the past we've all sort of had to say, well, I know it when I see it. Now we get to say, no, this is part of this Jesus and John Wayne thing. We know who you are, we know where you came from, and we know what you're all about.
Oh, thank you, Nathan. Really insightful, and echoing a lot of my own praises about the book. So from here, I think I want to kind of open this up for discussion on some of the main ideas that the books grapple with. And forgive me, I have a tendency to be very I like going from point A to point B historically, but I think one, that's what the book is for, and two, I also recommend the Dig podcast does a really good long-form interview with the author, where she kind of gives it that kind of same presentation. So I don't really want to just repeat something that was maybe already done better by the person who wrote it. So I think let's start. So I want to start with the big question the book opens up with. It's why so many evangelicals supported Trump, and how that ties into really the case she makes about how misogyny and machismo is kind of baked into a lot of these evangelical ideas. So as she courses through history, she talks about kind of a turn that the evangelical movement made in the early 20th century, emphasizing the male breadwinner, the male as patriarch of the nuclear family, and having kind of dominion over both the wife and the children. And this way of embracing these cultural figures who, and this is going to be very important talking about, who may not necessarily be paragons of Christian virtue, but they have a role in upholding this kind of patriarchal ideal. And obviously the name of the book, she starts with John Wayne, who again was not a particularly perfect Christian, had a lot of substance abuse problems, went through several divorces, but his movies portrayed this idea of like a man's man, taming the Western frontier through grits and violence as needed. Kind of going through, I think a lot about the way something really interesting to me, John Wayne being staunchly critical of any like social justice movements. He was part of several like anti-communist leagues. And, even going through his career, he was kind of like a running polemic against social justice critiques. Look at the film The Green Berets, which basically was there's a propaganda film for the U.S. military at a time when people were becoming hypercritical about the war in Vietnam. And then it sketches out how this evolves through the 70s and 80s. You have, Phil Schlafly, who we could probably do a whole thing about, really trying to kind of put fellow women in their place, successfully led a crusade against the Equal Rights Amendment. Very interestingly, historical parallels using a lot of the same tactics we see today, right down to campaigning against unisex bathrooms, which again we see in modern struggles against trans folks. And then, coursing out, I think it does a good job of sketching out the legacy of antecedents. So Mel Gibson, and so this book really helped me reevaluate the filmography of Mel Gibson in a big way, because I looking again at films like The Patriot, or of course The Passion, obviously, We Were Soldiers. It seems like Braveheart is a big one. Particularly, book talks about how a lot of evangelicals pushed the iconography from Braveheart as a model of Christian warriorhood.
The Gladiator.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious because that's not Christian at all.
Exactly. So bringing it all the way back up to Donald Trump today, there's this brilliant quote from the book. It might be my favorite passage where it's I can't remember if it's a minister commentating, but he basically, the book says, while Trump may have been a very bad Christian, he was a great Christian nationalist, and he knew how to wield that in his favor. I don't know if I'll quote directly from the book, but it's a very there's this great Trumpian speech they quote from directly, but it's in typical Trump styles, Christians being prosecuted everywhere. Oh my God, folks, have you seen this? Typical Trump speech. And it really ties together the way that to a lot of these folks, Christian nationalism, no pun intended, trumped actual Christian values. Now, Nathan, I'm going to kick it over to you, and I'm wondering your own thoughts on this, but also as somebody who was a reverend in 2016 and throughout, I'm sure you've also been asked this question a lot. And I'm curious about how you have also grappled with this question, both at the time and today. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on WIDR Kalamazoo.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to remember that fundamentalism, or I'm just going to call it reactionary Christianity, is always a reaction. It's always a reaction to something else. They love to pose as sort of protectors of some pure and ancient faith, but the reality is that conservative movements writ large are reactions to progress. And so if you want to go back to 1910 and even a little bit earlier, they were reacting to the Chicago School. They were reacting to textual criticism of the Bible that said, oh, hey, if we put together linguistics, language scholarship with anthropology and biblical study, we can actually determine where these parts of the Bible were written, at what time they were written, and X, Y, and Z. And then they were teaching ministers this in graduate school, which was what all ministers used to go to. And then the ministers would be sent out and basically churchgoers would say, wait a minute, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and how dare you say that these are historic documents, XYZ. So there was a reaction to that. That was followed by the Scopes monkey trial and a whole lot of other things. And so likewise today with the evangelical church, they are reacting to progress. Now, as far as the capitalization on patriarchal authority, that is, again, an anthropological issue. And I think that if any of your listeners are interested in understanding it from perhaps a more scientific perspective, I highly recommend Sarah Blafer-Hurdy's book, Mother Nature, which is, she's a primatologist and studies precisely this issue. What is it that drives primates as well as humans to have this patriarchal impulse? Long story short, it's resource acquisition. So in the life of a male primate, there is fear that you are going to be raising some other male's offspring. Females don't have this issue because every baby that they have comes out of their body. There's no confusion about that. You've never heard of somebody taking a maternity test. But for males, they have this deep-seated, I would say, evolutionary fear of wasting calories, wasting resources on raising offspring that's not their own. And so the solution to this is to control female behavior. In different cultures, we do it in a lot of different ways. For example, in some cultures, the woman is consigned or trapped in the house. Joseph Smith did this famously, the founder of Mormonism. He had 33 or 34 wives, I don't know. He built a house with 34 rooms and kept a wife in each room. And if they can't leave the house, then you know that your children are definitely your own. If they have to leave the house, then they need to be attended to by either their husband, who's their mating partner, or by a trusted other male brother, older brother, uncle, grandpa. If in some cultures, if that can't be facilitated, then they need to take the house with them. We see this in restrictions on the way that women are allowed to dress. For example, I don't want to single out the burqa because that is that's very aberrant in Islamic culture. But there's a lot of this sort of thing in Christian culture as well. Just look at the way we dress nuns. If they can't take the house with them, then you can de-incentivize going out. This is what we prefer to do in Western culture because under capitalism, everybody needs to work. But if you can somehow rig a system where you pay women significantly less than men, then they need to stay home to raise the children because they can't afford childcare. Likewise, this is the impetus behind the capitalistic project of the atomizing of the family, the invention of the nuclear family in the 1940s and 50s. You remove caregivers from the household, you create a standard where families are separated from each other, and then you've reinvented the burqa in a Western fashion. You've made it impossible for women to leave the house. So all of these things are designed to satisfy that impulse that males have to make sure that they're raising their own children and that the resources that they're gathering are going to their own benefit, to the benefit of their bloodline. Now, the big irony about this is that the Bible runs in stark contrast to this. From cover to cover, the Bible is very clear, and God is very clear that God doesn't care about bloodlines. God cares about covenant relationships. And I could go on about that for hours. But insofar as biology and psychology is always going to trump theology, they've invented for themselves an interesting sort of bizarro world Christianity, where they are extremely concerned with offspring and raising children. To do that, you've got to control women. Now, the other thing I'll say is that the Pew Foundation did a very interesting and very large-scale research study in the late 90s where they asked something like 10,000 Americans who'd never read the Bible to read the Bible, and they gave them 2 years to do so. And they tested them on a political gradient scale prior to and after reading the Bible and found that by an overwhelming margin, after having read the Bible, people tacked to the left on social issues. So the science demonstrates that actually reading the Bible with an open mind makes you more socially progressive, more open-minded, and more liberal. And then that makes sense when you understand that really the history of Christianity writ large has been one of sort of transnationalism, one of diminishing the importance of national boundaries and national cultures in favor of a global movement or a global personhood in Christ, and likewise has also elevated the role of women and diminished the importance of fatherhood for no reason other than Jesus Christ wasn't a dad. He didn't have kids. It wasn't what he was all about. So the evangelical church has always had to play tap dance with their source material. And that opens them up to appropriating other heroes that do fit that model, whether they're Christians or not. John Wayne is an excellent example, if somewhat a hilarious one. John Wayne, for example, he never served in the military. He very ardently avoided any kind of sacrifice during wartime. He hated horses, but none of that matters because of the image that he portrayed on screen. The same could be said of Mel Gibson or Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, Donald Trump's kind of a mincing queen of the Upper East Side. If he had his way, he would spend his time just commenting on Fashion Week. Donald Trump is in no sense of the matter a man's man or someone of heroic bearing. In fact, he's on the record saying that he would never change a baby's diaper because it was too icky. So this is not anyone who is, he's a very soft man, but his presentation, and remember, they loved him not because he was rich, but because he was a celebrity. And they were introduced to him by 14, 15, 16 seasons of The Apprentice, where this mythology of him being a big, strong man was spoon-fed to them. And Dumetz does a great job in Jesus and John Wayne of differentiating between the man himself and the presentation of the man. And it's really the presentation of the man that the evangelical church is obsessed with, because it serves as a countervailant to what the Bible actually says a man really is or really ought to be. So that's huge. I didn't mean to get lost in the weeds on that anthropology, but that also explains their opposition to abortion. Because if you prevent access to abortion, you are forcing women to be birthing people and diminishing their capacity to make any kind of decision or have liberty over their body. And then again, that's the goal, is the goal is to force women as to be providers and caregivers for your offspring. And I think that the white evangelical church specifically has got that in spades. So yeah, that's my impression of where that's coming from.
Oh, thank you so much, Nathan. And I think I'm just going to round out a little bit of context too. Is one of the more interesting things, I think this, especially later in the book, she really tackles these hypocrisies that many people point out, and the way that certain moral failings are ignored, while the Bible, certain parts of the Bible are weaponized for their own agenda. There's a great passage talking about the Kavanaugh hearings, which basically people were trying to equivocate the accusations. There was a biblical passage about like false accusations and that sort of thing. So it's very like kind of a self-servicing way of weaponizing Christianity that we've seen kind of represented in the Trump era. And we're going to kind of segue into nationalism. And I think a good way to do that, I really want to bring some light to the way, because I think there's this conception that, there's two different aspects of the support for Trump and Trumpian politics. And it's, those that think he'll be good for the Christian agenda, those who are like, terminally online and they're part of the alt-right troll culture. But I think there's a lot more overlap there than a lot of people would like to admit. I'm going to quote directly, this is page 187. In the years after 9/11, more extreme expressions of militant masculinity gained traction across American evangelicalism. As Godman revivals, evangelist Brad Stein challenged men to kick butts to grab your sword and say, okay, family, I'm going to lead you. Profanity was encouraged. Liberals, atheists, and the politically correct were denigrated, and men were called upon to combat the quote-unquote wussification of America. Now that I wanted to kind of segue, diving a little bit deeper into Christian nationalism. And as I mentioned earlier, it's this idea that has sprung up in American evangelism that, America is somehow God's chosen people. Although I don't think that's really mentioned anywhere in the Bible. It's this idea that like might makes right, and we're on the right high side of history because God is on our side, and it really bleeds out into our current politics in ways I think a lot of people may not necessarily make that explicit connection with. And you mentioned racism earlier, and I think like this really illuminates modern struggles over things like trans rights and critical race theory. Okay, this is a quote from page 38. Many evangelicals found it hard to accept that the sin of racism ran deep through the nation's history. To concede this seemed unpatriotic. Having embraced the idea of America as a Christian nation, it was hard to accept a critique of the nation as fundamental as that advanced by the civil rights movement. And again, this goes back to the civil rights movement of the 60s. This is not new by any means. And also thinking about like how it really has a deep explanatory power to why so many white people who may or may not call themselves evangelical have such a hostility towards like teaching about the history of racism in schools and trying to teach the truth about American history. It's not necessarily that they're engaging in bad faith. It's just on a deep and emotional level, they basically read such things as heresy. So I wanted to talk about how, the utility of Christian nationalism, how that's also kind of overlapped with, imperialism. White Christian evangelicals have highest level of support for U.S. military adventurism, for all of the wars of the past half century that many of us could deem as like unjust or basically fought on behalf of oil companies and such. I wonder if you could comment on the way that like Christian nationalism has been used, how it was used to like put Trump and people like him in power, and the way that feeds into U.S. imperialism. When, again, there's lots of other sects of American Christianity. Think of like the Plowshares movement, that they literally get arrested protesting nuclear weapons, while maybe the more well-known strain of American Christianity thinks we need like a warrior Christ going to like overthrow governments in the Middle East and such.
Hey, this is Wider reminding you not to drink and drive. Alcoholic consumption while driving reduces function of the brain, impairs your thinking, reasoning, and muscle coordination. Driving after drinking can be very deadly. Instead, plan a safe ride home with a designated driver, or call a sober friend to pick you up. This has been a message from 89.1 Wider FM, online at widrfm.org.
Hello, everybody out there. Sects of American Christianity, think of like the Plowshares movement, that they literally get arrested protesting nuclear weapons, while maybe the more well-known strain of American Christianity thinks we need like a warrior Christ going to like overthrow governments in the Middle East and such.
Yeah, well, and in the Bible, that's one of the meta-narratives of the Bible, is that it's always a small remnant. Now, it's hilarious that the evangelicals have fashioned themselves to be this remnant of the faithful when they're overwhelmingly a remnant of nothing. I mean, they're huge. They're a massive movement. The Bible is clear that those who are doing justice and loving mercy and walking with humility will always be a small percentage of those who claim to worship Jesus Christ with their lips. But I think that at the base of this is this nefarious, so capitalism reduces a human being to a commodity, or effectively a component in the creation of commodities for the enrichment of the ownership class. And this strips people of their ability to form a personal identity. In the vacuum that leaves, people will do anything to have an identity. And this is true both on the left and the right, but we see it a lot more publicly on the right in reactionary movements. People are desperate to have their life mean something. And they'll stick anything that they can in there. So you've got a lot of people, especially on the right, they're cosplaying as a human being. They're cosplaying as a person with value, because everybody worships something. And now there are certain components to your identity that are easy to get, and some that are harder. For example, I've helped build homes. I feed my family. I'm raising 3 children. I've got a great, healthy marriage going on 10 years. I'm very proud of the things that I've accomplished, and there's no reason for me not to be. But if you are a person for whom capitalism has stripped you of any sense of personal pride, accomplishment, or achievement, you're going to do anything that you can to find an identity, especially if it's free and it requires no work at all. I take my baby out to shopping or the store, and some baby boomer looks at it, and my baby, and they're like, boy or girl? That's always the first question they ask, boy or girl? And I'm like, well, that's kind of a weird thing, but whatever, okay, Natalie's a little girl, but they want to know which team she's on, because your gender for these people is something that you're born with, did absolutely nothing to acquire and get to celebrate as part of your identity. Likewise, being born in America is something that you did absolutely nothing to achieve, costs you nothing, but that you get to have it for free, and you get to wear the shirt, and you're on the team. The reality, Andy, is that transgender individuals actually do have to fight to achieve their gender. And so for me personally, I think that folks who are trans men are, in a certain sense, men who have fought harder than any other man in history to be a man, and they ought to be proud of that. Likewise with immigrants. Immigrant Americans have done battle against the forces of bureaucracy and the horrors of immigration in order to become Americans, whereas me, all I did was I came out of my mom in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and that boop, ding, I'm an American. So a lot of this stuff is just grasping for an identity. And to be an evangelical Christian is the easiest way in the world to be a Christian. You go to a church, you give them some money, you're quote unquote born again, they pray a magical prayer over you, and bleep, blop, bloop, now you're a Christian. Versus being a liberationist Christian like your Plowshares folks, or like your Christian Peacemaker teams, or your American Friends Network, or these radical leftist Christians, they actually have to put some skin in the game. Father John Deere sat in jail for 3 years. Dorothy Day, they tried to kill her. So when you see people on the left practicing the faith of Jesus Christ, they're actually saying, no, I would take a bullet for this. Likewise, my faith drove me to go to Palestine and to stand shoulder to shoulder with Palestinian Christians and say, let me sacrifice with you against this machine, this horrific machine of ethnic cleansing and military occupation by the Israeli state. So for your right-wing, quote-unquote Christians, it's just another shirt that they can put on, and they're filling the gap that capitalism has left in their life, because capitalism has reduced them to a machine. Another similar parallel that I see, I'm a hunter. I enjoy shooting guns, both to feed my family, but also for recreation. There's something in gun culture, though I hate using that word because that was never a thing when I grew up, which we call the black rifle guys. These are the guys that cosplay as tactical SWAT team operators or whatever. And these are guys that spend a ton of money on firearms, that spend a lot of time sitting in safes. And they don't hunt, they don't feed their family. And if you ask them, well, what do you do with your guns? They're like, well, I'm going to use them to protect my family from the government or whatever. You know they're not, because they would never shoot a cop. Versus guys, and I include myself in this, who I hunt every season. If you ask me what my relationship with firearms is, I'm gonna show you a freezer in my garage. And guys like me who hunt are typically not your really ardent Second Amendment supporters. We're just kind of like, leave us alone. We hunt in season, and God, these weirdos, these tactical weirdos show up at our gun ranges and are kind of embarrassing for us. So you're seeing that in the church with these white evangelicals. They're cosplaying as Jesus people. And Jesus and John Wayne, she does an amazing job of demonstrating exactly how easy it is to slip into that stream and pretend to be that person. I want to point one other thing out because it's fascinating to me. And again, I'm going to talk about Adam Kotsko. In Dr. Kotsko, in an N+1 piece, he wrote about sort of the roots of the evangelical church and why it is so inherently unsustainable. Like unto capitalism, it's that many of the early evangelicals of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when they were born again or came to Jesus, they were actually leaving a life behind. Frequently, it was in 12-step programs. They were leaving alcohol, they were leaving an abusive relationship or drugs or something like that, being born again, and then participating in a church culture that was, kind of pedagogically puritanical. But then they raised children in that culture, and the children had nothing to rebel against. They were raised in this evangelical vacuum, and so they were born again at the age of 11, 12, or 13 and just said, I want a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And there's no there. It's just an identity. Whereas their parents had actually accomplished something, oftentimes dragging themselves out of addiction or something that was killing them. Their children were just born and bred for Jesus camp. And so now we're seeing literally millions of these children adopt the label of ex-evangelical. And I can't really relate to them because, again, I was never an evangelical, but they're leaving it behind because they actually want to build for themselves a rich and meaningful identity that is more than just a sticker that they can put on their car or a shirt that they can wear. So Christian nationalism is, of course, the natural fallout from this. Nationalism is a joke. It's an absolute it's nonsense for any thinking person to say, well, one of the most important things in my identity is the patch of dirt that I was born on and the invisible lines that my colonial ancestors determined made me into this, that, or the other thing. It can be fun sometimes. I love to hate on Ohio as much as the next Michigander, but in no way, shape, or form is that rise to even the top 20 list of the things that I think are most important about my identity. But in capitalism, people need to fill that hole. They need something about themselves that's important. And so saying, well, I'm an American and I love America is really easy to do. And the reality is that the folks who are crossing our southern border, almost to a one, are faithful Christians. Catholics, Protestants, all sorts of flavors of Christians. And the Christian nationalists give the lie when they hate them, because they're not hating them because they're Christians or they're Mexican or anything else. They're just hating them because they're different. And the difference is principally that of their skin color. And again, racism, it's a very easy thing to do because it doesn't cost you anything to be a racist. And now it is costing people something, which I love, because, racists see them actually being asked to put some skin in the game for their religion of racism, and they're whining and moaning and complaining about it as though they're under attack. So yeah, it's really a movement of cosplayers taking themselves too seriously.
Thank you, Nathan. So I think I want to move on a little bit from the what to the how. And one of the other really great parts of this book, it has great explanatory power in showing you how we got to where we are today. I feel like some people, there's like a kind of a chicken and the egg thing when they're like, well, our political situation, America, sucks so much because there's so much reactionary Christianity. But that was very intentional. Kind of similar to, climate change and other issues. Like there were people, individuals and groups who had a very intentional strategy to seed these ideas and plant them around the United States, and that's where it grew from. And a lot of times grew from, a market-based incentive. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the kind of evangelical Christian media ecosystem that the author really sheds light on a lot here. I'm going to read 2 quotes from the book, and then I'm going to move on from there. But first one is this kind of more broader overview. The evangelical consumer marketplace was by the 1970s a force to be reckoned with, but this expansive media network functioned less as a traditional soul-saving enterprise and more as a means by which evangelicals created and maintained their own identity, kind of like you just talked about. An identity rooted in family values, in quotes, and infused with a sense of cultural embattlement. And I do want to spend some time talking about embattlement because that is a really important piece to this. Christian publishing, radio, and television taught evangelicals how to raise children, how to have sex, and whom to fear. And Christian media promoted a distinctive vision of evangelical masculinity. Finding comfort and courage in symbols of a mythological past, evangelicals look to a rugged, heroic masculinity embodied by cowboy soldiers and warriors to point the way forward. And I just inputting on how, again, this book gets a lot more specific into exactly who did all of this. But just as a quick example, when evangelicals began to fashion a vibrant media empire, and this goes back to the 50s, along with a national network of institutions and parachurch organizations that flourished outside of denominational structures. Graham, that's Billy Graham himself, published 24 books, and in 1956 he helped found Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of American evangelicalism. Nearly 700 stations carried his radio program across the nation and around the world. And the book also goes on to talk about Christian booksellers who they went from having just a few dozen bookstores in, I believe, the 70s to thousands all over the country. And it's important to understand that because, again, the excesses and toxicities of white evangelicalism didn't just come out of nowhere. There is kind of this media bubble that's been created that kind of predates, we think of the Fox media bubble or right-wing news media bubble. This was almost like a prototype for that in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And it can definitely explains how, you have so many people in this country who believe certain things that are antithetical to either reality or what other Christians or Americans might believe. So I wanted you to comment on that, but also Nathan, kind of as your own experience being a Christian reverend preacher, kind of speak to what is it like to try to counter that programming that is just so hegemonic in American Christianity?
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Make sure you follow us on Instagram to keep up to date with what's going on here at Wider. Also, check out our website, updated weekly by some of our amazing staff, online at widrfm.org.
It's interesting because a lot of the Christians who I work with come in sort of 2 flavors. The first are Christians who, akin to me, are very highly suspicious of any sort of authority that is inherited. So authority that exists only because it exists. The other flavor of Christians are people who believe that there is some sort of world beneath this world, and that it is inherently good. And they are good-hearted people for whom empathy is sort of a second way of life. And they're looking for an expression of this through their faith. And a lot of that second group of folks, they usually shake out either in the Unitarian Universalist Church or what I would call more liberal churches like the United Church of Christ. I'm not so sure that the UCC, I would label them as progressive. They're not really radical, though they love to use that word. These days, they're kind of a wholly owned subsidiary of the DNC, which is really unfortunate. If you want to find really radical Christian faith, you've either got to go to folks like you mentioned, Plowshares, the folks out at Los Alamos, the folks that you'll see, a lot of Catholics down at Protesting School of Americas, or overseas you'll see the Christian Peacemaker teams, or you need to go to the Black Church, places like Trinity in Chicago, where Jeremiah Wright was preaching, and where now Otis Moss III is preaching the true, what I would consider the true prophetic gospel, which just by its very expression ends up being anti-imperial, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and in many ways anti-American. So this Christian publishing industry, I'm not a huge proponent of the Enneagram. I know a lot of Christian liberals really are into the Enneagram system. I went through the whole thing. It was whatever. It's interesting. I don't care. I read my horoscope too. Who cares? Whatever. Life is short and full of distractions. But one of the most interesting things was that I heard in somebody Suzanne Stabile, who's a researcher into these sort of personality tests. And there's a very specific personality, which we call an Enneagram 6, who is a person who is very highly driven to focus on safety and security. And they are highly alert to danger. And that this is really an evolutionary function of being a human being who was responsible in some part for the care of their band or tribe or whatever on the savannah, and who had to be very alert and cautious to danger, both outside and inside. And it drove our species to exist. If it wasn't for people who were watching out for saber-toothed tigers, we'd all be dead. I mean, if it was up to me, I saw a saber-toothed tiger, I'd be like, hey, cool, maybe we can be friends, and then he'll protect us from the whatever. But no, it was these very cautious, I would say conservative individuals, safety-obsessed individuals who got us this far. They call them Enneagram 6s. But one of the things that Susan said that blew my mind was that by her estimation, fully one half of all Americans fit this description. So half the population is out there desperately seeking safety. Safety from what? Well, we live in a country under an economic regime that absolutely brutalizes the poor, not only their physical well-being, but also it couples that with this moral shaming that comes along with being impoverished. You might look at cultures like, the Indian subcontinent, for example, where there is a great deal of poverty. However, in different traditions and religions in the Indian subcontinent, you will see varying degrees of, either empathy or a sense of holiness attributed to poverty, and a sense, and I saw this a lot in Arab culture in the Middle East, both Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, who were very clear that the way that you treat poor people is the way that Allah will treat you. And so one of the things I never saw in Palestine or elsewhere, even in Lebanon, highly secularized, westernized Arab countries, were homeless people. There weren't homeless people because the shame fell on the families and communities of the homeless. In America, if you're poor, you get hit with a double whammy. Not only are you going to suffer, and you will suffer, and it's going to suck, but also you're shouldering this horrible moral deficit that people put on you, that you're considered poor because you're a bad person. So when you put a religious sort of shine on that, you teach people to look for something that is going to keep them safe. Safe from what? Moral impurity, and under capitalism, the moral impurity of poverty. And that is something that the Christian book-selling movement did very, very well. They coupled with the media enterprise, the shows like Leave It to Beaver, and I would say all the way up through shows like Roseanne, which, the show Roseanne is such a great microcosm of white American consciousness, because you've got ostensibly working class Americans living in a massive house whose children are attending good schools and this, that, and the other thing. But you teach them, if you do these things and purchase these products, you can insulate yourself from the terror that is lurking just over the horizon under this capitalist regime. And this is incidentally why we didn't see, I think personally, a massive uptick in religiosity amongst late Soviet citizens. You recall that in the early 1980s, the standard of living in the Soviet Union was higher than it was in the United States of America, though most Americans are so successfully propagandized that they would never learn that. You would expect under that regime an uptick when life gets better, people get more religious. But that did not, in fact, happen in Soviet under the Soviet regime, the Soviet government prior to Western expansionism and the full-on assault. It's happening in America because there's a threat, and this Christian book-selling movement. And I think that Kristen Dumetz does a good job, although she doesn't really hit the class nail on the head, but explaining they're selling you a panacea that is going to make life okay. It is going to make life safe for you. And if you do these things and participate in these things, you are going to be safe. The result of that is devastating. If you look at any of these evangelical movements, they're absolutely rife with grift, sexual predatory behavior. And it's astonishing to me as a church pastor, because I've interacted with thousands of Christians. I've pastored I'm now in my 7th church. And I've never once in my life has it even entered my mind to abuse or somehow grift off of these people who are good, honest, and looking for help. But in this evangelical movement, it's literally everywhere you look. You can't even open a Twitter without finding that some powerful white evangelical man has, God, today I saw a thing, some megachurch pastor from San Diego was spotted by his wife in his living room with one of his female employees, and they were in a state of undress. And he apparently told his wife that they had been cooking chili for a church function and had gotten chili on their clothes, and that's why they were naked. This is absolutely repugnant, ridiculous, and gross. But it is a function of selling this idea that you can be safe if you do these things. And man, I hate to keep being a Bible nut, but the Bible is really clear about this stuff. If you put your trust in horses and chariots, which is militarism, or if you put your trust in ritualism, in fasts and sacrifices, rather than justice and mercy, then you will be led to ruin. And that's what happens to so many of these people. They don't live fulfilling lives. They've been sold a bag of goods that's worthless, and they're being fleeced by these very powerful individuals, men like Donald Trump. My pastor's heart breaks for them, and I wish that there were a way to radicalize them and wake them up.
Sure. All right, thanks again, Nathan. It was really good. I think it's really important, especially talking about especially on my show, I always try to focus on how did this stuff happen? And this book, as we mentioned, does a really good job of laying out the organizations, the names, the dates that all of this stuff started germinating and kind of cementing itself into American Christianity, which I think is also a good segue into kind of the last thing I really want to hit on, which is the way some of these shifts in evangelical teaching coalesced with capitalist development. And I think you mentioned, the author doesn't really explicitly talk about class, but I think it's almost at a few points she accidentally makes some points about it. One of the first ones that really caught my attention was this is talking about really early turn of the century stuff, but they're talking about the transition from a sort of rural producer economy to an urban industrialized one. And she writes, a new corporate consumer economy meant that more men were earning a living by punching the clock, and self-discipline no longer promised the same payoff. As men moved to cities, the work they did changed significantly. For men whose strength had become superfluous, who no longer identified as producers, their very manhood seemed in question. So we look at the moves to kind of like recontextualize the family unit as this kind of atomized thing where you're at the head. It in their on their terms remasculizes men. It also helps isolate people in a way, because a lot of Christianity in America before that was very social, was very communitarian. And this is the beginnings we start to see where everything is like atomized. As Margaret Thatcher once said, there's no such thing as society, there's just individual families, blah, blah, blah. We see that to shift again when we transition into a service economy, again, trying to pivot and make sure men don't feel left out. But, hey, even if you're working at Walmart or something, you're a servant of Christ. And then talking about in the 90s how the culture wars start really coming into play. There's a great quote from Pat Buchanan speaking is like, the Cold War may be over, but there is a war of even greater imports, talking about like American values and American Christianity. And it almost feels like another way of like keeping people's eye off the ball. So you're not paying attention to material conditions. You're not looking at like who is causing the economic strife in your life. You are looking to fight these cultural battles. And again, it goes back to talk a little bit. I want to talk to you a little bit about the sense of embattlement, which is it not only does it kind of have explanatory power, trying to it causes poor people to blame the wrong people or institutions for their woes, but as I think needs to be repeatedly brought up, the biggest constituency here is this sort of middle-class white petite bourgeois who, they may not necessarily feel the same sort of pain when the economy tanks that poor people do. And this sense of culture wars and embattlement gives them the feeling that they are oppressed when really they're living in relative comfort. And, as much of the data pours out, the election of Trump was overall not about economic anxiety. It was about privileged groups losing their status, be that, particularly like white Christian men. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the way some of these teachings, and I think you've spoken this bit earlier in the discussion, but really put a fine point on it, how a lot of times these reactionary Christianity carries water for capitalism, and also how this sense of embattlement is used to make basically the people who have the most power and privilege feel like they're consistently under siege, and kind of what purpose that serves.
Hey, this is Skip Scudderman from Water, reminding you not to drive while you're high. It is against Michigan law to operate the vehicle under the influence of marijuana. It is always safer to drive when you aren't stoned. Stay safe out there, kids. This has been a message from 89.1 Water FM, online at widrfm.org.
Yeah. So one thing that's important for your listeners to understand with regard to the history of the church in America is that prior to, during industrialization in America, poor people did not go to church. If you were not independently wealthy, if you were not part of the capitalist ownership class, you didn't attend church on Sunday morning because you were working. There was no weekend. So people in the working class, they were not able to attend church, as we think of it today, until the advent of the weekend, until the labor movement gave us a weekend in the early 1920s. So until the weekend, most Americans didn't attend church because they couldn't afford to, because they were working. What they did have was camp meetings. This would be once or twice a year. You'd get a few days where you'd go out and they'd have a big camp and they'd sing hymns and they'd hear one of these celebrity preachers give a message. And then you had sort of religion in your extended family. Now, this issue was compounded in the 1950s with the invention of the nuclear family. Prior to this, you would have lived with cousins, aunts, uncles. You had allo parents, you had allo mothers, people to help you raise your children. You had multiple kids, and kids didn't leave when they turned 18. The advent of this new petit bourgeois emphasis on higher education, in my opinion, was simply a device that said, what we're going to do is further limit the options of women by taking their children when they're right at the perfect age to be caregivers, 17, 18, 19 years old, and we're going to send them off to something called college. So they're not going to be able to provide care anymore. Before the advent of this, they would remain home, they would help raise their siblings. And for men and women who worked, you would typically train your children up in whatever, whatever they would apprentice to whatever industry or artisanship you were a part of. All of that's been thoroughly destroyed by the modern project of capitalism in America, and so you do have these atomized families. Now, the question of, and again, you're absolutely right. People didn't, the poor overwhelmingly didn't vote for Donald Trump. He wasn't elected because of this sort of nonsensical J.D. Vance hillbilly elegy nonsense. Trump rode to power on a wave of racial anxiety amongst petit bourgeois white people. Women and men. I don't want to let white women off of the hook, because for them a lot of that class anxiety influences their behavior, because perhaps they fear living in a situation akin to the poor working class women of America, whose lives are oftentimes absolutely miserable and outside of their control. How do you fix this? How do we liberate people from this? I wouldn't be a Christian, I wouldn't be a pastor if I didn't believe there was a way forward. And I think that there are three answers that the Bible gives to the toxic patterns that Kristen Koves-Dumetz lays out in her history, Jesus and John Wayne. The first is the abolition of the concept of the nuclear family, or the idea that having a biological relationship is somehow more valuable to God than a spiritual kinship. The Bible is clear on this. And I want to put out front, I have a wonderful relationship with my mom, and we're friends. And as adults, we've got a great, I love hanging out with her. She's a party monster, and we have a great time. And I love my kids, and I hope that when I grow up to be a 60, 70, 80-year-old man, my kids want to hang out with me. But the Bible is really clear that that is not a given. In fact, Jesus teaches that it is, in fact, your spiritual kinfolk, your religious kinfolk, your fictive kin, or your intentional family that God considers to be those who you are in relationship with. And all other relationships are dissolved in light of that relationship. In fact, one of the very last things Jesus does on the cross is he effects an adoption between his beloved disciple, his closest disciple, and his own mother, Mary. He says, literally nailed to the cross, he says to the beloved disciple, who's not his biological relative, he says to this person, behold your mother. And he says to his mother, behold your son. So adoption is important in the Bible. Part two of that movement is that it also dissolves any idea of national fidelity or fidelity that we have. That the Bible is very clear that God is a God of all nations, and that this was the fundamentally revolutionary move that was made in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament by Yahweh to say all of those other gods, paternal gods of nations, which is what existed in the Levant, those are all subservient to me. I'm the one God of planet Earth, and follow me. And nations are secondary to that. And the third thing is that we have to help people understand the ways in which the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament, but to some degree also the New Testament, is absolutely antithetical to capitalism. The laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy forbid lending at interest. They forbid something we call latifundialization, which is a big word that just means buying land and joining it together. It was prohibited to purchase land and then give it to your children. because that was seen as depriving the poor of land that they could then own and till. Food was to be shared. Tithes were for the benefit of the poor. And in the New Testament, the church fathers and mothers took everything. We talk about tithing in the church as giving 10% to the church before taxes, of course, but in the New Testament, they didn't give 10%, they gave 100%. Everything that you owned went to the church, and then that's where we get that famous line from Acts, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And in fact, there's a great story in the book of Acts where a wealthy person joins the church and holds back some property that they own, and God strikes them dead for doing so. And that doesn't get preached on a lot because it's horrifying in light of modern American capitalism, but that was the way that the church was set up. So you have these three functions. You've got the nuclear family, you've got nationalism, and you've got really the project of capitalism, or what I would call ownership, that are totally antithetical to the overarching meta-narrative of the Bible, to the overarching story of the Bible. If you follow the God of the Bible, it appears that God really wants to do away with these things. Now, there are subservient demons and minor and lesser gods. These militarism is one. The Hebrews, the ancient Israelites, they did not put their trust in horses and chariots. They didn't keep horses and they didn't ride chariots, because when God was bringing them across the Red Sea and God split the waters, it was actually the chariots and the horses that caused the Egyptians chasing them to drown. Some Talmudic scholars believe that the Red Sea was a giant salt flat, and that the Israelites fleeing captivity were able to get across that salt flat on foot because they didn't carry anything with them. Remember, they fled into the dead of night, they ate flatbread and just ran into the desert. And the Egyptians that were chasing them were carrying horses, spears, and all this stuff that caused them to get bogged down in the salt flats and drown. Okay, well, that's a literalist interpretation of a very important story, which is that it is important to God that we don't burden ourselves with possessions and the things that will get us bogged down in the Red Sea. And militarism is part of that. It's part of this. Militarism is a kind of atheism in the Bible that says instead of turning to God for our salvation, we're going to trust in weapons. We're going to trust in our own physical strength and might. Likewise, in the New Testament, Jesus says those who put their trust in wealth, in money, and in possessions are fools. They're foolish because they're missing the point of a life worth living for the ages. All of these threads come together in the modern Roman Catholic project of liberation theology, which arose out of Latin and Central America's response to the American colonialism of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I'd say we could begin with Roosevelt, but it really became institutionalized under Reagan. You had Christians living in Central and South America who viewed America as this evil Moloch god of militarization that was coming to steal their wealth and take away their land. And for them, their Christian faith spoke directly to this issue. And now we have liberation theologies of all oppressed peoples. There's Black liberation theology, as codified in the work of James Cone, where Jesus is a black man crucified on the cross. He talks about Martin Luther King Jr. crucified on the crosshairs of an American rifle. You've got Palestinian liberation theology in the writings of Naim Atik, who writes very passionately about vineyards and what happens to wealthy men in the Bible who steal their neighbors' vineyards. You've got Dalit liberation theology from the Indian subcontinent. And for everywhere there's a marginalized people, there is a liberation theology of Christianity that arises out of for people of privilege, like myself. I consider myself part of the petty bourgeois. I'd love to be part of the revolutionary vanguard, but I fully acknowledge my role in this capitalist machine. I become a better Christian when I read their liberation theology because it shows me where I need to go. For a lot of Americans, especially evangelicals, but also for more progressive white Christians who are living lives of comfort, when we say the words to them, Jesus is for the poor, God has a preferential option for the poor, God's heart breaks first for the poor, oppressed, and enslaved, their reaction, their defensiveness is to say, well, what about me? Doesn't God give a damn about me? I'm important, I'm a person. And the response has to be, yes, God desperately loves you, but God needs you to get on Team Jesus. And that means that your job is very special and specific. You need to run to those margins. You need to flee, Christian, into the places of darkness and oppression and pain and brutality and colonialism, and you need to stand shoulder to shoulder with those self-same people that Jesus cares most about. And that is how you serve Jesus Christ. It's not that you don't have a place in the Bible. You do. And there are great Felix and Lydia, and for God's sakes, Paul, St. Paul. These were people of comfort who, upon following Jesus, fled into the margins of society and dedicated their lives to ending oppression and injustice. And that's how we're good stewards. And in fact, I would argue that there is no more pressing issue for Christians today than global climate change and the climate catastrophe, because for Christians specifically, we have given a very clear mandate by God in Genesis and also in Revelation, the beginning and the end of the book. In Genesis, we're tasked with carefully stewarding the creation so that it is returned to God in the same condition in which we found it. And in Revelation, a very special and spectacular punishment is reserved for those who abuse and destroy the earth. So that's liberation theology. It's this amazing project that was created by the poor, for their liberation. And as Christians of comfort and means, we have the ability to access it, read it, understand it, and then in solidarity stand with them. And if you're like me, you use whatever tools you have to siphon money especially, but also resources away from the project of capitalism and give it to them. And don't tell them what to do with it, but empower them through that resource acquisition to carry out the ministry and mission of liberation. So yeah, I just gave you a sermon. Sorry about that, Andy, but this is my shtick. You know?
That's quite all right. I was actually about to ask you about liberation theology next, but I do want to just kind of make a fine point on some of the stuff you're saying. You know, I think it's important, as much as we would recommend you check this book out, Jesus and John Wayne. Also understand there is a deeper history of American Christianity, liberatory Christianity, that is equally important to delve into. Some examples that come to mind, one of my favorite chapters, I think, like, really, there's been, particularly on the part of reactionary Christianity, this effort to mutually exclude leftism and movements for liberation away from Christianity, like being on the left, a socialist, a Marxist, etc., is unchristian. I think back to the Communist Party of Alabama, whose main success derived from, they were very poor black sharecroppers in like the very racist Deep South. And, they literally had like a copy of Lenin's State and Revolution in one hand and a Bible in the other, and, also a revolver on the hip. All of those things made them like extremely successful movement. They were able to get concrete and tangible gains, again, in an extremely repressive situation. Moving forward, you have MLK, of course, who was a proponent of some form of social democracy, a proponent of an anti-capitalist alternatives. And you fast forward to today, you have people like Dr. Cornel West, Dr. Reverend William Barber, who is really trying to continue that good work. So you already talked a little bit about liberation theology, so I think I have a more specific question. I think I'll leave this with you. Something came to mind while we were talking. I was thinking about the idea of holding space, and also just the times we're in, the ascendance of fascism. Recently in the neighborhood, my neighborhood, there was going to be a bunch of fascist incels trying to do a punk show. They were effectively deplatformed, and this made me think of the idea of holding space and the importance of, in this context, we have this very reactionary Christianity, which is radicalizing, which is working hand in hand with a lot of fascist elements, sometimes, in some cases, fascist paramilitaries. Anybody's been paying attention, the mood. I think even a lot of centrist newspapers and magazines are openly starting to talk about civil war now. What is the role and the importance of holding space at a time where, these reactionary Christianities are trying to claim this. They're the loudest people in the room, not necessarily the largest, but they're trying to claim the space at a time where we could very well see some of these reactionary elements take power in 2024 and beyond. What is the importance of holding that space for people who understand like the real liberatory power of Christianity and maybe even religion more broadly? Y'all are listening to 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo.
I think that we need to bring back movements like, I think of immediately the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, the CCSA, which was a network of Christian pastors and Jewish rabbis who worked to provide women with safe access to abortion in the 1950s and 60s prior to Roe. I think that there are going to be opportunities for Underground Railroad work where we need to, as Christians, look out for people who will not be able to defend themselves from these fascists, especially as they continue to infiltrate the organs of state violence, the state monopoly on violence, things like the police, but also municipal government organizations, to shepherd them, protect them, and get them to safety. That's going to be a very critical line of work. And remember, Harriet Tubman carried a pistol. She carried a single percussion cap pistol when she was running the Underground Railroad, but after the Civil War, she carried a Henry revolver, and she was not afraid to use it. So that's some of that work, is that shepherding work, the role of protector, the role of helping people navigate a path to liberation and freedom. The other thing I think of immediately is Jesus's the line that gets used so often, taken just brutally out of context, when he says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." If you read the actual story in the temple of that context, Jesus is being questioned by people who are in league with the fascist Roman state. He's being put to the test publicly by these fascists, by your landlord types. I could name names. I can think of a couple of folks on the city commission who would meet this definition, and basically say, well, is it appropriate to pay taxes to Caesar? What he does is he asks one of them to show him a coin. And this person is supposed to be an advocate for the people. Ostensibly, this person is presenting themselves as a holy individual, as somebody who's one of the good guys, and the person produces a Roman coin rather than a Jewish coin, a temple coin. They produce a Roman coin. So thus, and then Jesus says to them, well, whose face is on that coin that you've got in your hand? And they say, Caesar. So in that, he unmasks to the crowds that, look, this person who claims to be for you is actually in league with the fascist government. And Rome invented fascism. I mean, Rome is the father of fascism. In fact, when fascism is in America, we still use Roman iconography. For God's sakes, the fasces itself is a bundle of spears held in the fist of an eagle, and that shows up on our money and our currency. So one of the things that you can do to hold space, Andy, is continue to unmask these people. Continue to say, no, you in fact are in league with the powers and principalities of the world. You're in league with the cops and the oppressors and the people who especially want to hurt minorities and women, and especially trans folk. A huge part of the incel identity is a deep, bitter hatred of women and trans folk, and they have already shown us that they will commit extreme whose coin are you holding in your hand when teach the young, teach other people. These people, they talk a good game. They stand up in front of the forum. They stand up in front of the people like the men in the temple and confront Jesus and say, oh no, we're the good guys. We're on team good. But if you look at the face on the coin in their pockets, you're going to see who their real God is, who their real master is. And oftentimes it's an evil God. It's vengeance, empire, racism, white supremacy, the misogynism. These are their real gods. Unmask them. Do so continuously. Name names. Andy, I know I don't have to tell you this. I'm saying this for the benefit of your listeners. Liberals hate to name names. Liberals love to just say, oh, everybody's a little racist and everybody's complacent in this system and blah, blah, blah. But we can't talk about Jim Ritzema, or we can't talk about the mayor. We can't talk about these. We can't name these people by name because that's mean and it could get them in trouble, or it's going to make us feel bad. Name names. Be clear on who the organizations are. What are their leaders? Who are their leaders? Who's running the show? With these incels who are running these little fascist house parties, name names. Who's their landlord? Name their landlord. Who do their neighbors know? So unmask them and do so fearlessly, because the Bible says that which is done in darkness shall come to light, and those who do their good works in the light have nothing to fear. And so I'm an open book. I've been unmasked for years. You know everything there is to know about me. I have no secrets because I'm not ashamed of anything that I do. I have been doxxed 1,000 times. Within 6 hours of purchasing my new home, I was already doxxed on their little American Patriot website. But I have nothing to hide. These individuals do. Unmask them, Andy. That is how we hold space. And then what society will do, because people are good, they will say, actually, you know what? We're tolerant, but we don't want fascists in our neighborhood. Whether they do it from an opinion of, well, it brings the housing values down and leads to violence and that sort of thing, or they do it because, no, these people are jerks. They need to be reformed. And we don't want them around here. Simply unmasking them is 50% of the battle. So that's how we hold space.
All right, Nathan, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your weekend to talk to us. If y'all like what you heard today, again, the book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, is written by Kristen Cobes-Dumez. If you have suggestions for future book club readings, let us know. I think we're going to go ahead and sign off. Nathan, any other parting thoughts before I let you go?
God bless you, and Godspeed, Andy. This is super critical work.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. Have a good one.
You too.